Hello everyone, welcome to Docker in 10 minutes. Today we'll be talking about Docker volumes. This video is divided into two series. So the first part will be covering about named volume and in the second part we'll be talking about bind mount. This will give you a good understanding of how Docker volume is used. And without any further ado, let us get started. All right, so before we delve into the topic of Docker volume, let us first do a quick recap of what we discussed in our last session. So, what exactly is containerization? So, containerization is simply the process of packaging your application and your dependency to execute them agnostic to the environment. So, this bundled package with application and all the dependency is called a container. So that's simple as it is. And the main idea of Docker container tool or using Docker service is just so that you can create your application, you can deploy them, and you can run them. So this whole idea is based on this principle of build. So you build it, deploy, you ship it, and you run it as quickly as possible. And you saw from our last video how quick the whole process was. And if you see here, this is what I was trying to show you here is this is the shared kernel that the Docker host uses for all of its container. And then we have the base image. So what exactly is the base image? So base image is nothing more than a binary. So it consists of different binaries and libraries. So if you go underneath and look at the Docker file, which we will do in our upcoming session, so that Docker file just is a combination of different binaries and libraries. And based off of that base image, we run off and we deploy different containers off of the image. And while I mention you that, there is also like two different types of containers. So one is this one is a OS container versus an application container. So OS container is what we tried on last time, like running a BusyBox, Alpine, Linux, Ubuntu. So those could be running in multiple different services because multiple different services could be using those container versus application container is a little bit more specific based on like as you see here there are different hardware requirement. So there is RAM, CPU, memory, different software and applications. So this is basically used when we want to create a service specific to our use. So that's when we deploy an application container. And this is a little bit more vast in terms of networking. And this is very specific to your use case versus this one is more lightweight and this one could be used in multiple different services. And one of the example that we discussed about in our earlier section is this microservice architecture. So let's say we have this one feature, a login feature in our website where we want to deploy different containers. So what we do is for that particular service, we have one image which has all the packages and dependency. And based off of that image, we can deploy as many containers as we want. So we might have multiple servers running in multiple regions. So we can simply deploy as many containers. So that way, it helps us to achieve this idea of lateral and vertical scalability. So scalability is not a problem. So this is how um, containerization will help us to scale our application up and down very quickly and in a very efficient manner. So what is a volume? So volume are basically the preferred mechanism for persisting data generated and used by the Docker container. So if you see this official image from Docker, you see a container. So if we have our data stored in the same container, what happens to our data when the container is turned off or we stop or we delete the container? All our data is lost, right? So that is the reason we do not want to store our data in the container, but in this case it's rather stored somewhere in the host location. And this is the external file system or the Docker area which we call it, where we store our data. And this is very important to understand eventually when we move toward Kubernetes, because there are different external sources also we can store our data, like NFS server or S3 bucket, which we will see in our upcoming videos. And in this session, we'll be talking about two different type of volume. One is bind mount and the second is named volume. We don't worry too much about this temporary file system mount, because as you see here, this is actually ephemeral, and once we remove the container or delete the container, this will go away. So this is not very useful in our use case. So the primary goal of volume is to store our data outside of our container. And the good thing is that volume does not increase the size of container using it. It exists outside of the life cycle of a given container, as you see here. This is our container. We store our data outside in the host machine, and this is not going to affect our container. So our container is still lightweight. That's a very good thing about using data volume. And why do we actually need content like data volume? So there are like two main reason I remember. Okay, so first of all, it's very easy for us to save our data, right? So it saves our data even when the container is gone. Our data is still safe, so saves our data. That is number one. And number two, so let me do with another color here. So number two, the importance being, it helps us to share our data. What do I mean by that? So do not forget the fact that two container, they can only share their data through their same shared Docker volume. They cannot interact, their data cannot interact directly. They have to use the shared system. So this is how we can share data between two different container. And the difference between named volume and bind mount, which we'll again see in our practical hands-on practice, is first named volume, which is the number one, which is here, as you see. This is actually managed by Docker, and the default location where the data will be saved will be inside var live docker and then volume. Again, this is what we'll see very soon. So this is where the data will reside. Versus in the bind mount, the second option, this is where we can decide where our data is going to reside. So this is especially useful if we are importing our data or cloning our data from the Git repository. This is again we'll see in our lab. And always remember the fact, okay, so whenever we are mounting the data, always remember this arrow. So this is the container and this is our volume. So once we bind meaning once we connect or once we make that binding between our container and our data or our Docker volume, the data can go either way. Okay, so I draw this arrow on purpose because let's say if I add a data to my volume, that same data will be copied over to my container. Similarly, if I add some data to the container, the same data will be added to my volume. So volume is technically, this is my storage, right? So this will create that, let's say, interaction between the container and the volume where addition of data in both will affect each other. So this is what will happen. And always you'll have to create a volume before you spin up your container. Please remember those 2 points. Those are very useful. All right. And so basically, bind mount is dependent on the directory structure and the OS of the host machine, whereas named volume is managed by the Docker. So this is one of the reason backup and migration is quicker and easier with named volume. Why? Because all of the volume of the data is stored in the same location. So we know where those data reside. Versus in this one, every server could have different volume location. So obviously This will be easier for backup. And also, it works with different Linux and Windows containers, so it's very flexible. But both of them helps us store our data. That is the purpose of a volume. So now, once we understand those theory, let us go and do some practice. All right, since we are crossing the 10-minute boundary, let us do the hands-on practice in the next video series. But if you like my videos so far, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. It will really help me, and I have put a lot of effort to put this material together. I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you.